Guthrie. It is Tuesday. This is actually Nancy's house. This is the closest I've been able to get to the back side of the house, and I'm going to take you really up close in a second. Some interesting things that you can't see from the drone that you can only really see from back here.
On day 59, Brian Enton stood at the back of Nancy Guthrie's property. He was not watching from a distance with equipment, but on foot, right in the desert brush, close enough to make out the 3 doors at the rear of her house. He had a retired Pima County homicide detective standing next to him, and what that detective told him about something he had spotted weeks earlier in the early drone footage from this investigation is something nobody else in this public conversation had named.
8 weeks into this investigation, a reporter stood at the back of Nancy Guthrie's property on foot, not watching from a distance with a drone, not broadcasting from a press briefing podium, standing in the desert brush behind her home close enough to make out the 3 separate doors at the rear of her house. He had a retired Pima County homicide detective standing next to him, a man who spent his career working violent crimes in this exact jurisdiction for this exact department. And what that detective told him about something he had spotted weeks earlier in the early drone footage from this investigation is something nobody else in this public conversation had named. Not in any article, not in any commentary, not in any analysis from any platform or outlet covering this case. What he saw raises a question about what investigators were actually doing at that property in the first 2 weeks of this case that still has no public answer. He watched investigators conducting forensic photography at Nancy Guthrie's property in a manner that in his career, across decades of violent crime investigation in Pima County, he had only ever seen applied in one type of case. Not missing persons, not standard kidnapping searches, not general crime scene documentation, shootings, violent assaults, stabbings, cases where investigators already knew enough about where a specific person stood during a specific moment of violence that they could return to that exact position, stand there, and photograph what that person would have been able to see. They call them perspective shots, and they were being taken at Nancy Guthrie's property within the first 2 weeks of this investigation. Tonight we are going to explain exactly what perspective shots are, exactly why a retired Pima County homicide detective found their presence at this property deeply significant, exactly what they tell us about what investigators had already reconstructed about this crime before most of the public conversation even understood what it was looking at, and exactly what they mean when placed inside the full physical picture of what happened at that house on the night of February 1st. Hit that like button right now. Share this video immediately because this is the most forensically significant development in the public record of the Nancy Guthrie investigation that almost nobody has discussed. Subscribe to Black Veil Crime Files with notifications on because in a case where official briefings have been this carefully managed, the details that surface publicly tend to arrive without warning and reshape everything. And stay until the very last second of this video because the reconstruction of that night built from everything we now know is the clearest picture anyone outside the investigative file has assembled. Let us start with where we are. Day 67. What we know and what is still missing. Today marks 67 days since Nancy Guthrie was forcibly taken from her home in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona. 67 days since the doorbell camera at her front door was tampered with in the early hours of February 1st. 67 days since her pacemaker application went offline at 2:28 in the morning, placing the moment she left the reach of her phone in the dead of a desert night. 67 days since her family arrived at the house to find an immaculate interior, a propped open back door, and blood on the front porch. And still no arrest, no named suspect, no confirmed sighting, no publicly acknowledged forensic breakthrough. What is dominating the conversation around this case right now is the ransom notes. Multiple communications claiming to hold Nancy or claiming knowledge of her whereabouts have surfaced and circulated in the media and in the online community. Savannah Guthrie said publicly in her first interview back on air that she believes some of the notes her family personally responded to were genuine. She was equally clear that many of the communications circulating are not real, that people are fabricating contact for reasons ranging from reward money to attention. The FBI has not publicly verified any specific communication as confirmed contact from whoever actually took Nancy. The standard for verification in these situations is specific and demanding. Proof of life details that only the responsible party could know. A communication thread that holds across multiple exchanges without contradiction. None of that has been publicly confirmed as met by any of the notes that have surfaced to date. That uncertainty, the hovering question of whether anyone is still communicating, whether Nancy is alive to be communicated about, whether the reward has simply attracted fabricators testing their luck, has consumed most of the analytical bandwidth around this case over the past week. It is understandable. It is the most emotionally urgent open question. But while that conversation has been running, something that happened 8 days ago has been sitting largely unexamined in the public record. Something said on camera by a man who spent his career working violent crimes in Pima County, this exact jurisdiction, something he observed in footage that was publicly broadcast, that thousands of people watched, that reporters and retired detectives and online investigators combed for anything they might have missed, and none of them named it. What the reporter found at the back of the property. Day 59 was Tuesday, March 31st, 2026. 7 weeks into the investigation. A reporter who had been on the ground in Tucson since the beginning, building source relationships, flying drone footage, physically present in a neighborhood that national media had largely departed, reached a position he had never reached before in this investigation. The back of Nancy's property, on foot, on the neighboring side of the private boundary line, close enough to see the actual structure of the rear of her house from ground level. He had built the relationships with neighbors in the weeks prior that made that access possible. And what that position showed him corrected something that most people covering this case had assumed for weeks based on aerial drone footage. He had believed, as the drone footage had suggested, that the back of Nancy's house had sliding glass doors. Standing there close enough to read the actual structure, he corrected himself publicly on camera. There are 3 separate doors at the rear of the property. None of them sliding glass. One sits beneath a covered overhang on one side of the outdoor patio area, fitted with glass panes across the upper portion. A large glass panel nearby, which multiple observers had described as a sliding door from the drone footage, is a fixed window. The second door on the far side of the outdoor living area is fitted with a screen. That screen door is the one investigators were specifically told had been propped open when family members arrived the morning of February 2nd. Not left slightly ajar. Propped. Beyond the main house connected to the property at the far end is the entrance to the casita, the small guest structure that forms part of the complex. 3 distinct rear access points. None of them, according to any public statement from the Pima County Sheriff's Department, showed evidence of forced entry. PCSD has not publicly stated that forced entry occurred anywhere on this property. Not the main house, not the casita. That absence is worth examining, because it narrows the access question to one of 2 possibilities. Either the perpetrators exploited a vulnerability Nancy herself had left open, or they had already identified and created a point of entry during the reconnaissance that preceded February 1st. That reconnaissance appears in the investigative record. January 11th has been established as a date of interest. A point 3 weeks before the abduction when someone may have been at or near the property. Investigators were specifically reviewing camera footage from neighbors across multiple dates in January. And one neighbor told the reporter something the coverage has moved past too quickly. Their dog woke at approximately 1 in the morning on the night Nancy disappeared, looked toward her house, and behaved in a way the neighbor said it never normally does at that hour. It is not forensic evidence, but 1 in the morning aligns with the documented sequence. Doorbell camera disconnecting at 1:47 in the morning. Motion detection activating at 2:12 in the morning. Pacemaker application going offline at 2:28 in the morning. If someone was already moving around that property more than 40 minutes before the first device event triggered, a dog fixed on that direction in the middle of the night is a thread that has not been fully pulled. The terrain behind the house and what it tells us about planning. The terrain behind the house, seen clearly for the first time from ground level, makes the question of prior reconnaissance feel less theoretical and more concrete. Beyond the fence line, it is dense desert. Scrub, low brush, cactus with thorns on everything, small animal burrows in the dirt, no street lights, and in the words of the retired detective who stood there that morning, at night with a partial or absent moon, absolute darkness. You could walk through it if you had been back there before, if you had mapped it, learned where the footing held and where it did not. memorized where the fence gates were relative to the pool and the doors. If you had not been there before, moving through that terrain at speed in the dark while managing anything or anyone would be extremely difficult. The absence of any reported evidence of activity in that desert scrub is itself a data point about where the perpetrators moved. It suggests they came and went by routes they already knew. Routes that had been walked before. Routes that had been memorized in daylight and tested in the dark before the night they used them. The reporter introduced the man he had brought with him that morning. A retired detective from the Pima County Sheriff's Office where he spent decades working violent crime investigation in this exact county. Not commenting from a television studio on a case he read about. Not offering analysis from a distance. The same department. The same jurisdiction. The same terrain. He had built his career on cases like this one in this community. And when he talks about how this department processes a crime scene or how a homicide investigation unfolds in Pima County, he is speaking from professional familiarity that is categorical rather than comparative. The retired detective had never been to the back of Nancy's property before that morning. He stood there, looked at the doors, looked at the brush, and in the course of that conversation told the reporter something about the early drone footage from this investigation that the reporter himself described on camera as something he had never heard anyone say before. Something that nobody else had publicly named. What the detective saw in the drone footage. The reporter asked him directly, "What did you notice when you watched the early drone footage from this investigation?" The retired detective placed it specifically in time. Early on in the case. His estimate was within the first week or possibly the second. The FBI had returned to the property. The specific visible purpose of that return visit, as he observed it in the drone footage, was to remove cameras from the roof of the house and he believed also from the pool house. Those cameras were not original fixtures. The reporter had noted earlier in the broadcast that they appeared to be new installations put up after Nancy disappeared, visible in the drone footage from the early weeks of the investigation. The FBI's return to take them down suggested they had served whatever monitoring purpose they were placed for. And while that removal was happening, while investigators were working around the exterior of the property, the retired detective saw the forensic team doing something else that he recognized immediately from his career. He saw what appeared to him to be perspective shots being taken. The reporter asked him to repeat it, to confirm what he had said, and the retired detective confirmed it. Perspective shots, at a property where officially no shooting had been reported. No stabbing, no documented assault scene, a missing person, and a forensic protocol that in 3 decades of violent crime investigation in Pima County, he had only ever seen applied in cases involving shootings, assaults, and stabbings. His immediate reaction in his own word when he saw it in the footage was that it was weird. And that observation from a career Pima County detective watching publicly available drone footage that thousands of people had already seen and analyzed had not been named by anyone. Not in any article. Not in any podcast segment. Not in any online analysis across the entire period that footage had been available. What perspective shots actually are, and why they matter. A perspective shot is not a general photograph of a crime scene. It is not an overhead view. Not an establishing wide shot. Not a photograph taken from wherever a photographer found a useful angle. A perspective shot is a photograph taken from the exact physical position a specific subject occupied at a specific moment in an incident. At their height, at their angle, along their confirmed line of sight. The photographer stands where the subject stood. And from that exact location at that exact orientation they capture what that person would have been able to see. What was in their field of view. What was accessible to their vision. What the geometry of the scene looked like from the position that person occupied during the moment of the event being reconstructed. The purpose is documentary. These photographs become a permanent part of the forensic record. They do not interpret. They do not argue. They document spatial reality from a specific confirmed location, establishing with photographic evidence what was and was not visible from a given point in a way that can be presented to a grand jury, to a civil court, or to a jury in a criminal trial without requiring a witness to describe it. The clearest and most common application of this technique, and the one the retired detective used to explain it, is officer-involved shooting reviews. When a law enforcement officer discharges their weapon, The investigation that follows involves returning to the scene.
Forensic photographers come.
The officer is asked to identify the exact position they occupied when they fired. They return to that position. A photographer steps behind them and documents the scene as the officer would have seen it from that exact spot. What was directly in front of them? What was to either side within their realistic visual range? Whether the threat they reported was visually accessible from the confirmed position. Whether the distance, angle, and spatial geometry of the scene are consistent with the officer's account of what they saw and did. Those photographs become part of the administrative review, part of any grand jury presentation, part of the civil litigation record if one follows, and in cases where criminal charges are brought, part of the trial record. They are not open to argument about whether the photographer interpreted the scene correctly. They document what is physically there from a documented position. The application extends into violent assault investigations. When two parties give contradictory accounts of where they were standing during a confrontation, investigators place people at the reported positions and photograph the sightlines. What was visible from the claimed location? Was the reported position consistent with the physical evidence at the scene? Or did the trajectory of an injury, the placement of blood, or a footwear impression suggest the person was somewhere else? In stabbing cases involving questions of approach, of whether a victim had the spatial opportunity to see an assailant coming, of whether the angle of entry into a room is consistent with the account given, perspective photographs document the geometry of the encounter in a way that physical description alone cannot. The evidentiary value of this kind of positional documentation has been proven across dozens of cases that went to trial and in cases where it prevented injustice before a trial concluded. There is a documented case in New York, a 1994 shooting in Queens, where crime scene reconstruction through positional analysis conducted nearly 3 decades after the fact placed the actual shooter at a location within a building that was irreconcilable with confessions extracted from 2 men who had been convicted. 2 men who had spent a combined 37 years in prison had their convictions vacated. Not because new witnesses came forward. Not because new physical evidence was collected. Because investigators stood in documented positions with documented sightlines and photographed spatial reality. And that spatial reality contradicted the story that had put those men in prison. The photographs did not lie. The original investigation did. What makes perspective shots possible, and why their presence is significant? What makes perspective shots possible and what makes them meaningful rather than arbitrary is that they cannot be taken from a general area. There is no forensic value in standing somewhere approximate and photographing outward. The physical evidence has to have already placed a specific person in a specific location with enough precision that standing in that location and documenting the view is a meaningful act. Blood spatter placement establishes where a person was standing when an injury occurred. Footwear impressions in soil or on a surface establish direction of approach and specific placement. Trajectory analysis from an impact establishes the geometry of where a subject stood relative to the point of contact. Camera footage with confirmed angles establishes the position a documented subject occupied within a scene. All of that physical reconstruction has to exist before a photographer can stand in a position and take a shot that belongs in the forensic record. The photograph is the documentation of a position the investigation has already established. Not the discovery of a position it is looking for. This is the detail that made what the retired detective observed at Nancy Guthrie's property significant the moment he identified it. He watched it happening in the footage. He knew what it was. And when he processed what he was seeing, forensic investigators working in a manner consistent with positional reconstruction, his immediate reaction was that it was weird because there was no public information about a shooting. He has never seen this technique applied in a case that did not involve a shooting, a violent assault, or a stabbing. He said that directly on camera. In cases that were not officer-involved shootings or violent crimes, that is where those things come into play. He was careful not to overstate his conclusion. He offered 2 alternative explanations for what he may have been observing in the footage. One was height calibration. Perhaps the cameras removed from the roof were being used to establish measurement data about the property's geometry from a height perspective. The other was entry point sightline analysis. If someone had come over the wall or through a gate at a particular location on the property, what would they have been seeing when they arrived on the other side? Both explanations are possible. Neither belongs in a standard missing person search. Height calibration from confirmed positions and entry point visual field analysis are the forensic language of crime scene reconstruction, of investigators who have built enough of a theory about how a specific person moved through a specific space that they are committing that theory to the photographic record, the interior, and what the source told the reporter. Before we get to where the perspective shots place inside the full reconstruction of that night, there is a confirmed detail about the interior of Nancy's home that was shared on day 59 that has not received the attention it deserves. The reporter confirmed something his source close to the investigation had shared directly. He had been told that there were no signs of an assault inside Nancy Guthrie's home. The interior, when investigators first entered, it was described as mostly clean. Some of the rooms the source specified were immaculate. That word carries weight in a case where an 84-year-old woman was forcibly removed by what multiple experts believe was a coordinated team operating in the early hours of the morning. Immaculate rooms. And it maps exactly to what Savannah Guthrie described in her first public interview. That when her sister and her sister's husband arrived at the house the morning of February 2nd, they could not immediately understand what had happened. The house looked normal. They thought initially there had been a medical episode. Maybe paramedics had come in the night and taken Nancy out through the back because the back doors were propped open and the interior itself offered no obvious explanation. The absence of interior disruption is not the signature of a panicked improvised crime. It is the signature of a controlled, deliberate operation by people who knew the layout, knew how to move through a space without disturbing it, and planned every step of what they were doing before they arrived. The retired detective's reconstruction of the night. The retired detective's broader reconstruction of what happened at that house connects directly to the perspective shot observation. Because both pieces of information speak to the same underlying structure of what he believes occurred on the night of February 1st. His assessment of the number of people involved runs between 2 and 4. The logistics of what appears to have been accomplished, removing an 84-year-old woman from a residential property in the early hours of the morning without triggering neighbor responses, without leaving interior trace, without producing any camera footage of Nancy herself being moved, require coordination that a single individual operating alone cannot provide. The backpack carried to a residential property at 2 in the morning is not a burglar's supply. The retired detective named it for what he believes it was on camera. A kidnapping kit, prepared in advance, assembled for a specific purpose related to a specific target. That level of preparation reflects planning conducted well before anyone set foot on that property on the night of February 1st. His reconstruction of the sequence runs as follows. Someone was already inside the property when Nancy returned home from dinner on the evening of January 31st. That person managed her inside the house. And that is precisely why the interior showed no visible disruption. A controlled operation by a prepared individual who knows the layout does not produce the scatter and chaos that an unexpected confrontation generates. Everything in that house stayed where it was because the person who moved through it had planned exactly how to move through it. Then a second person was positioned at the front. Nancy, still ambulatory, was guided toward the front door. And at the threshold, at the front steps, at the moment she could see the street and understand with certainty that this was her last chance, something changed. She resisted, and the blood came from that moment. The retired detective's reading of the blood pattern itself is specific and it matters. The drops fell straight down.
No lateral trajector.
No travel across the surface of the step or the ground. No smearing consistent with movement while bleeding. No arterial directionality indicating force from a distance. The drops fell straight down directly beneath where the person was standing. That is the physical signature of a head wound or a nasal injury in an upright stationary person. Blood falling vertically from the point of impact, pooling directly below without lateral spread. It is not the pattern of a struggle sustained across a space or a body being dragged. It is a single contained moment of violence at a fixed point. Person standing at the front door. A strike. Blood falling straight down beneath them. Then movement out of the frame to a vehicle. Into the darkness. That vehicle was not visible in the driveway or immediately at the property in any of the footage reviewed. Which means whoever drove Nancy away from that address had a vehicle positioned elsewhere. Down the street. Around a corner. Close enough to move fast once she was outside the fence line, but far enough to stay out of reach of any nearby camera. If there was a waiting vehicle operated by a third participant, the minimum configuration becomes 2 people at or inside the house and 1 person behind the wheel of a car staged down the street. The retired detective described that configuration as the one most consistent with the logistics of what appears to have been accomplished. 3 individuals working a coordinated extraction in a residential neighborhood in the early hours of the morning with assigned positions, a prepared route, and a vehicle already in place. Placing the perspective shots inside the reconstruction. Now place the perspective shots inside that reconstruction. Investigators standing in specific positions at that property photographing specific sightlines means they had identified from physical evidence where someone stood during the violence that produced the blood at that threshold. Whether it was the position of the masked figure documented on the doorbell camera, reconstructed from the confirmed angle and supported by the blood spatter placement. Whether it was a position mapped to the person the retired detective believes was inside, someone who moved through the interior and guided Nancy toward the front without leaving interior trace. Whether it was an entry point at the back of the property, the screen door and its line of sight toward the interior, with investigators documenting what a person approaching from that direction would have been seeing as they came in. All of those are possible. All of them require that investigators had developed enough of a physical reconstruction to stand somewhere specific. None of them belong to a protocol designed for a missing person search. The blood at the threshold is the most significant data point here, because that blood is what makes positional photography forensically meaningful at that specific location. Straight down drops from a stationary person at the front threshold. A photographer standing at the confirmed position where that blood originated, at the height of the person who bled there, documenting what that person would have been able to see. What the street looked like from that spot. What the vehicle staging zone would have been visible from there. What the masked figure would have appeared from that exact position and height. All of that is now in the investigative file, as a photograph, as a permanent part of the forensic record, not as a description or a reconstruction or an analyst's assessment, as a documented image of spatial reality from a confirmed position. And none of it is public. The early investigative failures and what was lost. The early investigative failures are part of this picture because they define the gap between what the scene could have preserved and what was actually documented before it degraded. A source close to the investigation confirmed that the team assigned to the initial response was not composed of experienced homicide detectives. The supervisor overseeing those critical first hours had, according to that source, never previously investigated a homicide before being placed in charge of the homicide unit. Former Pima County Sheriff Dr. Richard Carmona, who also served as United States Surgeon General, appeared publicly and said that the sheriff made a scene release decision that should have been the lead detective's call. His characterization was direct. The scene was corrupted by that premature release. A retired FBI agent said that had the Bureau been present from the first hour, investigators would have pulled tiles from the front step for high-velocity blood spatter analysis, a process that recovers positional and directional data embedded in the surface beneath visible pooling. Data that cannot be recovered once the surface has been walked on. Data that would have documented with even greater precision exactly where each drop of Nancy's blood came from, at what angle, from what height, from what position on the threshold. That analysis did not happen in the first hours. And yet the FBI came back within the first week or possibly the second, as the retired detective observed in the footage. They were there removing cameras from the roof. And while they were there, forensic photographers were working the property in a manner consistent with positional reconstruction, standing in specific spots, documenting specific views, at a property where officially no shooting had been reported. No stabbing, no documented assault scene, a missing person, and a forensic protocol that belongs to violent crime reconstruction. Whatever the early response failed to preserve, the FBI's return to that property and the work conducted there during that visit represents a deliberate effort to reconstruct what could be reconstructed from what the scene still held at that point. That is not the behavior of an agency that accepted the scene at face value or treated this as a standard missing person protocol. The investigative tools likely deployed and the silence they produced. The retired detective also raised the investigative tools that have likely been deployed at a scale the public communications have not reflected. He mentioned geofencing, the technique of placing a theoretical boundary around a geographic area and identifying every cell phone signal active within that perimeter during a specified window. That capability applied around a 2-mile radius of Nancy's neighborhood in the hour before and after the documented device timeline should theoretically identify any phone that was present and active during the operation. The fact that no one has been publicly placed at the scene through that method, if it was applied, either means it was not applied or it produced results consistent with a theory that has circulated in the community. A cellular jammer can be purchased and used to suppress signal activity within a limited radius. If one was active near that property in the early hours of February 1st, geofencing data from that area may have a gap in it that corresponds precisely to the timeline. A gap shaped exactly like the 41-minute window between the doorbell camera going offline and the pacemaker application going silent. That is a detail the retired detective raised as a possibility, not a confirmed fact. But in the context of an operation this carefully planned, the possibility is not trivial. An operation that disabled a doorbell camera, used a backpack prepared in advance, moved through a residential neighborhood without triggering visible neighbor responses, and sustained operational security for 67 days and counting, is an operation where someone thought about cellular signals before they showed up. 67 days later, no arrest, no named suspect, more than 1,000 tips reviewed by the FBI, a combined reward of over $1 million that nobody has claimed. The retired detective addressed the silence around the reward directly. He raised the possibility that the person who organized this operation understood from the beginning that participants represent the primary risk. Someone capable of planning and executing a crime at this level and sustaining operational security for over 2 months might be capable of deciding that the people who could talk are the people who should no longer be available to do so. He said he has seen that logic play out in homicide cases before. The first person arrested is typically the first one to provide information. And everyone still free knows it. Whether that mechanism is part of what explains the silence here, whether participants are unable to come forward rather than unwilling, is not something anyone outside the investigative file can answer. But the sustained silence in the face of a $1 million reward is itself a data point that investigators are certainly accounting for. Professionals or lucky? And why the answer is probably both. The retired detective's assessment of who did this has evolved across the weeks he has been analyzing this case publicly. He walked back somewhat an early assessment that the visible behavior of the masked figure at the door, the apparent fumbling with the backpack, the awkward movements visible in the doorbell footage indicated amateurism. 2 months later, with the investigation unsolved, his view is that the successful execution and the continued operational silence suggest a level of capability that the visible clumsiness at the door does not fully represent. His current position is that it is likely a combination of both. Professional planning and some degree of improvised execution on the night itself. Someone who is genuinely incompetent does not maintain this kind of operational security for 67 days. Something about this operation reflects experience and preparation even where the visible behavior suggested the opposite. The planning was professional. The execution had moments of visible awkwardness. And the operational security maintained afterward suggests that whoever is responsible has a working understanding of what talking and getting caught cost. That combination, professional planning with moments of visible human error, is in many ways more difficult for investigators than either pure professionalism or pure amateurism. Professionals leave consistent signatures that investigators can profile against. Amateurs make mistakes that leave recoverable evidence. A combination of both produces a crime scene that partially fits known profiles and partially defies them. What the perspective shots tell us and what comes next. Let us bring the full picture together. What the perspective shot observation adds to the documented picture of this investigation is this. Within the first 2 weeks, investigators were not running a missing person protocol at Nancy Guthrie's property. They were running a violent crime reconstruction. They were standing in specific positions identified from physical evidence, and photographing the world from where specific people stood during specific moments of this crime. That visual record exists. It is in the investigative file. What a person standing at the confirmed position of the blood at the front threshold could have seen. What the entry points looked like from inside them. What the geometry of this property reveals about how someone moved through it in the early hours of February 1st. All of it documented. None of it public. The ransom note conversation will continue for as long as the authenticity question remains unresolved. That is understandable. But the physical evidence picture that prospective shots represent, built in the first 2 weeks before the public conversation even understood what it was looking at, is a different kind of record. It is the record of what investigators actually reconstructed about this crime as opposed to what they have chosen to share. Two things can be true simultaneously. The ransom note question is genuinely unresolved and genuinely important. And the investigators working this case built a physical reconstruction of what happened at that property in the first 2 weeks that the public has never been given. The prospective shots are evidence that the second thing is true. They are evidence that within days of Nancy's disappearance, investigators had identified with enough precision where specific people stood at specific moments during this crime that they were committing that geometry to the photographic record. For a grand jury, for a court, for a record that does not degrade the way memory does. A record that exists and is waiting. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 67 days. She is 84 years old. She is a mother. She is someone whose absence has been felt not just by her immediate family, but by the hundreds of thousands of people following this case across every platform. The sustained public attention is not background noise. It is a variable investigators account for. Sustained public pressure produces better outcomes in missing person cases. That is documented across decades of cases. This community is part of that pressure and it matters. If you have any information about Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, please contact the FBI directly or submit a tip online. A reward of $1 million remains active. You can remain completely anonymous. Leave a comment below right now and tell me what you think the prospective shots were documenting. The position of the person at the front door where the blood fell. An entry point at the back of the property. Something deeper inside the house that the physical evidence was precise enough to place. Tell me what your read is on why that forensic protocol was being used at a property where officially no violent crime had been reported. And tell me what the sustained operational security of this operation tells you about who did this and what they are capable of. Subscribe to Black Veil Crime Files with notifications on. In a case where the official briefings have been this carefully managed, the details that surface publicly tend to arrive without warning and reshape everything. We will be here when they do. This is Black Veil Crime Files. I will see you in the next one. Black Heart.